Hi again. John Stott is dealing with the Jerusalem Council. The discussion is over. The letter has been sent. And now he deals with the sequel to the council, that is Acts 15:30 to 16:5. Having shared with his readers the text of the letter, Luke now documents its reception by the largely Gentile churches, first in Syrian Antioch, secondly in Syria and Cilicia, and thirdly in Galatia. Antioch receives the letter first. Antioch was named at the head of the letter as its first recipient, because it was there that the original controversy had broken out, and from there that the appeal for help had come. The men were sent off and went down to Antioch, where they gathered the church together and delivered the letter. The people read it and were glad for its encouraging message. Judas and Silas, who themselves were prophets, said much to encourage and strengthen the brothers. After spending some time there, they were sent off by the brothers with the blessing of peace to return to those who had sent them. But Paul and Barnabas remained in Antioch, where they and many others taught and preached the word of the Lord. Stott comments, this gathering together of the church in Antioch must have reminded them of a similar meeting sometime previously, that is in 14 verse 27. Paul and Barnabas were present on both occasions. Then it had been to receive a report of the first missionary journey with its wonderful news of the conversion of Gentiles. Now it was to receive the Jerusalem letter with its equally wonderful news that Gentiles who had believed in Jesus were to be accepted as Christians without the need to become Jews as well. Small wonder that, on hearing the contents of the letter, the people were glad for its encouraging message. Judas and Silas, now identified as prophets, stayed on for some time and said much to encourage and strengthen the brothers. But then they returned to Jerusalem, sent on their way with the blessing of peace. The statement of verse 34, that Silas decided to remain there, is obviously a gloss. The best manuscripts omit it. It was probably added to explain how in verse 40 Silas was in Antioch, but it contradicts the plain statement of verse 33 that he and Judas both left. Paul and Barnabas stayed, however, and with many others taught and preached, literally evangelized, the word of the Lord. Now Syria and Cilicia received the letter. The single province of Syria, to which Antioch belonged, and Cilicia, in which Tarsus was situated, had been the scene of some of Paul's earliest evangelistic endeavors. It evidently had some Gentile churches, for they are specifically named at the head of the Jerusalem letter. But before Luke can narrate how the letter reached them, he is obliged in his honesty to tell the sad story of how Paul and Barnabas came to separate. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, "Let us go back and visit the brothers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Stott says, we observed that it was sometime later, perhaps when winter gave place to spring and travel became feasible again, that Paul made his proposal to Barnabas that they should revisit the Galatian converts and see how they were getting on. Barnabas agreed, but wanted to take his cousin John Mark with them, perhaps to give him a second chance. But Paul considered this unwise, for he took a serious view of Mark's desertion and lack of perseverance. The disagreement between them was so sharp that they parted company, Barnabas taking Mark and sailing to his home country, Cyprus, while Paul chose Silas, whose recent ministry in Antioch had evidently impressed him, and they were commended by the church to the grace of the Lord, just as Paul and Barnabas had been for their missionary journey, back in chapter 14. God certainly overruled this melancholy disagreement. That's the words of Calvin about this event. God certainly overruled this melancholy disagreement, since as a result of it, out of one pair, two were made, as Bengel commented. But this example of God's providence may not be used as an excuse for Christian quarreling. It was now that he, that is Paul, though with Silas, as we have just learned, went through Syria and Cilicia, which would involve their walking through the majestic narrow pass in the Taurus Mountains, known as the Cilician Gates, strengthening, the Jerusalem Bible says, consolidating the churches, without doubt by delivering the letter as well as by their teaching and encouragement. Now Galatia receives the letter. This is the beginning of chapter 16. He came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was a Jewess and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The brothers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Paul wanted to take him along on the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. As they traveled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. Stott comments, Lystra and Derbe were the last Galatian towns to have been visited on the first missionary journey. So now, as Paul approached them from the east, Derbe and Lystra were of course the first to be revisited. The most notable event took place in Lystra. Here lived Timothy, a disciple, and his mother Eunice, who was a Jewess but had become a believer. Presumably both mother and son had been converted during Paul's previous visit about 5 years previously. Timothy's father, however, was a Greek, and because in verse 3 the verb was hyperken, is in the verb was, that which is hyperken, is in the imperfect tense. Some commentators surmise that he was now dead, that is, Timothy's dad. Since Timothy had an excellent reputation with the Christians in both Iconium and Lystra, Paul wanted to recruit him into his mission team, not just as a companion, but as a worker, perhaps to take Mark's place as Silas had taken Barnabas's. His Jewish-Greek parentage would give him an entree into both communities. But although he will have been brought up by his mother in the Jewish faith, he had never been circumcised. So Paul circumcised him because of or out of consideration for the Jews. So Paul circumcised him, it says, out of consideration for the Jews who lived in that area, and to make his ministry acceptable to them, since they knew about his Greek father and would have guessed that he was uncircumcised. It is really marvelous that so soon after Paul's hot indignation over the Judaizers in Antioch and his vehement statements against circumcision in his letter to the Galatians, he should now be prepared to circumcise Timothy. Little minds would have condemned him for inconsistency, but there was a deep consistency in his thought and action. Once the principle had been established, the circumcision was not necessary for salvation. He was ready to make concessions in policy. What was unnecessary for acceptance with God was advisable for acceptance by some human beings. Probably Timothy was also ordained before leaving Lystra. At least Paul and the church elders laid their hands on him, presumably to commission him for his ministry. Now, as Paul, Silas, and Timothy traveled from town to town, they delivered the decisions contained in the letter, and in consequences the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. It's noteworthy that in each of these 3 paragraphs which describe the reception of the Jerusalem letter, Luke makes a similar statement about the church. In Antioch, Judas and Silas spoke the word in order to strengthen the brothers. That's 1532. Then Paul and Silas went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches, 1541. And as they journeyed on through and beyond Galatia, the churches were strengthened, 16:5. The first 2 verbs are both episterizo, as in 1422, where we noted that it is almost a technical term for the establishing or consolidating of Christian individuals and churches. The third is a similar verb, stereo, to make strong or firm. So wise and healthy was the Jerusalem Council's decision, incorporated in their letter, that wherever its good news went, the churches grew in stability and steadfastness. Next time, the permanent lessons of the Jerusalem Council, and we'll put a link into Paul's custom in preaching. He went to the synagogue wherever possible in his new missionary outreach. His policy, explained in 1 Corinthians 9 and elsewhere, to the Jew I became a Jew, or to the Jew first.